but for Lewis to race to third, and in George's case to show strong performance up until his crash, I think is a good result for us and hopefully something we can take into the next few races. Was George's DNF due to the crash, and how much damage did George have on his car? Well, first of all, I think George drove a great weekend, so did Lewis for that matter. I think if you looked at the difficulty getting through qualifying in the mixed conditions, to end up with both cars in Q3 in decent positions, that was a great result for the team and great work from both drivers. At the start of the race, I think George drove a great stint on the tyres. He was managing his tyres well, and we were starting to see the pace come for him as we were getting towards the end of that stint. And unfortunately, he just clipped the curb in turn 8. That was enough to unsettle the car for him to lose the rear end and crash on the exit of turn 9. And as you can see from the footage, he'd done quite a lot of damage. He damaged the front wing, broken the rear rim and therefore had a puncture, and that's what caused us to bring him in. The DNF itself was actually due to brake wear. So you push the brakes really hard at a circuit like Canada. It's a lot of big stops, and we could see in our telemetry data that the brake wear on George's car was getting out of control, and we could see that we weren't going to make the end of the race if we carried on as we were. And we could also see where he was in traffic, in the DRS train, having to overtake the cars in front of him. It was almost going to be impossible to manage his brakes, and unfortunately we had to retire the car. In terms of the real damage done to the car, actually, in some ways we got lucky. You know, the damage to the front wing, obviously we could change the wing at the pit stop. The damage to the tyre and the rim, obviously we changed that at the pit stop. And the floor rear wing pretty much came unscathed. But I think when you have a shunt of that magnitude, it's always going to unsettle the car. It's always going to leave the car not quite balanced as you want it to. So George had to deal with that through the rest of the race. How did the disruptions on Friday affect qualifying in the race? Well, if you didn't see it, the first practice session on Friday was affected by a failure of the CCTV cameras. And the stewards decided that the practice session was not safe to run without those working because they couldn't see where the cars were on track. So we lost the whole of the first session. In the second session, it was extended by 30 minutes to give us a bit more time on track, but also ended wet. So I think in the end, we ended up with about an hour and a quarter of running. I guess when you have a situation like that, it's the same for all teams. All teams have got to get used to that problem, got to deal with that problem. And we go into the race weekend with an amount of simulation work. We've got a base setup of where we want to be, plus some options we'll want to try. So we were able to work through those. We were able to really focus on the long run, which is what we thought was important. So yes, we lost out through track time, but so did everybody else. Were we pleased with the performance, and have our developments gone in the right direction? Well, as you all know, we brought an upgrade a couple of races ago. We've now had a chance to see what that performs like at different circuits. So first of all, we're really pleased to say that has done what we expected. It's helped the car move forward and we're generally more competitive. I think this weekend, we said before the weekend that Canada would be a more difficult circuit for us. It's mainly low speed corners and straights, something that hasn't been brilliant for us in the past. So to come out of this weekend, to qualify with the cars 4th and 5th, promoted to 3rd and 4th, and then to race in a strong way, all right, beaten by Alonso, but for Lewis to race to 3rd, and in George's case to show strong performance up until his crash, I think is a good result for us and hopefully something we can take into the next few races. Would a one-stop strategy have worked better for us against Aston Martin? Well, I think when we look at the data from the race weekend, we can say that a one-stop strategy was probably the right strategy for the circuit, but only in a normal race. So as it was, we had a fairly early safety car with George's incident, and that meant the two ways of doing a one-stop would have been to pit under the safety car and then run a very long stint on the hards. And I think we'd have seen far too much degradation for that, and we'd have been vulnerable to cars from behind later in the race. The other alternative would be to do what Ferrari did, which is to stay out under the safety car and then pit later in the race, so running a longer first stint. Now for Ferrari that worked out because they were stuck in a DRS train with slower cars in front of them, and they were able to jump them and then use their inherent pace in the race. For us, if we'd have stayed out, I think we'd have just been vulnerable to the cars around us and we wouldn't have ended up in a better place overall. Why did we not retire George immediately? Like you, I was watching the footage on TV in the race support room. We saw the crash and thought, oh, that's not coming back to the pits, the car's out of the race. But actually George realised that Potentially the only damage he'd done is the rim and the puncture and the front wing, and maybe he could get it back around and bring it into the pits, and that's exactly what he did do. And in fact, he said after the race that he remembered a race where he didn't bring the car back, and he thought that was the wrong thing to do. So having got the car back into the pits, we had the right people look around the car, make sure there was no damage, make sure we were happy for it to safe to run, looking through all the data that we get back in the telemetry, making sure that all the suspension was safe to run. And we felt that if we put a set of tyres on it, put a new front wing on it, we could send it out and see whether the car felt right to George, because we were happy with the data we were seeing. And as it turned out, the car was safe to run, and George was able to run up until the point we were struggling with the brakes and having to retire him for that reason. Which of the coming tracks are going to suit our car the most? Well, I guess having said that Canada was going to be difficult for us, it's a bit difficult to stand here and say it's hard to say, because we made a prediction about Canada, but I think it's always difficult to know. I think where we've seen the car struggling is more the low speed corners, and so if we start looking at circuits that have got more medium and high speed content, I think we'll do better there. So Silverstone would be a good example of that. Austria shouldn't be too bad for us either, so let's hope we go well in both of those. So the last one's no question, but just wanting to say we're looking good, keep up the hard work. Well, first of all, really big thank you for that. I think we're always really conscious of the fact we haven't produced the car we want to produce, we haven't produced the car that you want us to produce, and actually it's really nice to be now racing, at least for podiums, being able to show what we're capable of doing, and hopefully giving you some enjoyment to be had watching our races. And hopefully we can turn that into more upgrades, more performance over the races to come, and hopefully start fighting for some victories by the end of the season. So thank you very much for all your comments, it's always really appreciated.